I know, working as an activist on these issues, that there is no way that even people of my generation, if I could put it this way, understand it. Certainly not John McCain's administration. That's not personal. That's the fact of his age and his upbringing and his knowledge. And it's not what we need for the 21st century. It just isn't. But what we do need is a good intergenerational spread of expertise and an exchange of ideas that's constant and intense. You people, I mean, when I have need for true understanding of the information age that we're living in, I go to my 13-year-old daughter. You guys are a little bit out of it, already a little bit too old. Since I have children that range from 13 to 26, I know their relative capacities, and our 13-year-old's absolutely the best at all of this. But the knowledge that you bring and the perspectives are absolutely vital to this. And what I find ever more thrilling in the university is the chance to share, interact, and work together to solve these problems. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Sachs. We're going to have about 15 minutes of question and answer. As I'm sure you've noticed, we are recording this talk, so to maintain the quality of the sound and also to make sure everyone can hear you, please use the microphones on the tables in front of you. Just hit the red button, or the little button, the light comes on, and make sure you turn it off when you're done talking, because only 2 work at a time. The other thing to keep in mind is we do have to be out of here by 9:45 because there is another class coming in. So please keep your questions brief and actually questions. Thank you very much. Professor Hansen will be moderating.
You mentioned before in the drylands region of issues relating to resources and to poverty. I was wondering what you think of the alternate explanation of governance, taking the specific example of Somalia, with the northern third of Somalia as the de facto independent state of Somaliland, and not having as many issues arise from Somaliland as opposed to the Somali state centered in Mogadishu.
Look, I think, first of all, that poor places have poor governance because governance requires resources like every other line of activity. It requires judges, it requires police that are properly paid, it requires judicial records, it requires deeds, and it requires the ability to mobilize and sustain coalitions, and it requires the ability to meet basic needs in a society if a government is to have legitimacy. So extremely impoverished places can't have good governance by themselves. They can't even meet the basic needs of society, so they can't be stable. So it's the poorest places in the world that are the most unstable, that are most prone to fall into violence, most prone to see the kind of collapse. And you can find better governed and worse governed examples in poor countries, but Somaliland is not going to solve its problems, by the way, on its own. So I'm not going to look to that as a solution, because I don't believe that there is a solution to Somalia's problems without our engagement in a very, very different, not just our engagement, by the way, but there's $1 trillion going into the Middle East. Let them do some of this as well, but without outside help to create a kind of physical infrastructure of survival, schools, health, education, fertility reduction, water supply, livelihoods, there's no solution at all. I flew over Somalia a few months ago. I've never seen a more parched landscape, actually, than I saw. I was absolutely shocked. I was not flying over to tour it. I was flying over from Asia to Addis Ababa, and it was startling to me, though I know what the drylands look like, just absolutely how dry, but you could look down and see human settlements there. But you could also understand that those settlements barely survive physically, and there's no chance of development as a self-generating process on their own. One of the things that we see, by the way, in the data is that when the rains fail, violence is triggered in Africa. So this is one of those ways that social science usefully disentangles directions of causation. And so if you have droughts leading systematically to conflict, it tells you how close to the margin of survival people are. And I think it's a telltale sign of what is being faced in those places.
Yes.
I have two questions. The first is, in your talk, I noticed that you seem to be implying that sort of the McCain attitude towards the Middle East, a lot of it's, ignorant or whatever, and of course it makes sense that we're having problems with them because there's so much instability and there's poverty and there's climate change, and you referred to Southeast Asia and you referred to the instability in Africa, but those regions haven't produced nearly as much hostility towards Americans or Westerners as the Middle East has, and you didn't refer to too much.
I'm sorry, as which?
East
Central
Asia,
Asia.
Southeast Asia, and
Yeah.
Africa
Yeah.
haven't produced the same level of hostility towards the West as the Middle East has, and you didn't refer to too much going on in the Middle East. You mostly talked about Asia and Africa. And I mean, maybe I'm just a victim of the news media, but I haven't seen the same level of hostility.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings me to my next question. If we're not supposed to trust the newspapers, where do we get our information?
We have meddled in the Middle East in the most irresponsible and provocative ways for more than a century. So much of what's called bad governance of the Middle East is our creation. And we have done more to create the conditions of illegitimacy or despotism, mainly oil-centered, than I would say any other force. And this is part of U.S. security doctrine, our right to meddle, that has been going on for a long time, from Operation Ajax in 1953, when the U.S. took over the imperial mantle from the British Empire. The British Empire irresponsibility goes back already to the Sykes-Picot Treaty and for dozens of years after that. So we've never treated the Middle East other than as an object of our manipulation over energy. And it was the Carter Doctrine, I think, one of the few things I regret about Jimmy Carter's presidency, because I admire him tremendously. But it was the Carter Doctrine that threats to the Middle East oil were threats to U.S. security, and it's essentially the framework in which we invaded Iraq and in which we have done so much other destabilization. So I wouldn't take straightforwardly this idea that all that benighted region, if it would only modernize like us, which is the usual way that Americans tell this story. I don't believe it. I think we are after something else in that region than modernization. And it has 3 letters, comes out of the ground, and is a very, very powerful driver of our economy, of our military, and of our hidden way of thinking about these issues. And that's why there's more resentment.